Okay, here goes then. We also are featuring throughout the week this Twitter feed with a hashtag that's specially dedicated to the workshop and the public event on Wednesday night. So if you're Twitter inclined, please feel free to use it. I'm not a Twitter person myself, although I might come out of the lurking in the weeds for this occasion. Okay, so we'll try to hit this. Some housekeeping details then. Live streaming is going on of the presentations, but if you have any concerns about privacy of your information, then we can opt your presentation out of, break the link so that there's no live streaming. Also, you can request no tweeting of your results if you feel that would be appropriate. The library here that's hosting us, you may have already picked up the students are in process of studying for their exams, so they should be pretty quiet, but we should ourselves not make too much noise, so no discos during the workshop. The fire alarm is scheduled to be tested at 9 a.m. tomorrow, so that might be at the start of our workshop, so we might have to factor that in. Otherwise, there's no other alarms scheduled. So take the stairs, don't use the elevators, and congregate outside the library in the main plaza. That's the standard procedure. We've got a workshop dinner on Wednesday night. It's a set menu for 4 courses and some wine tasting for those who enjoy wine. So if you haven't let me know already, please advise me of any dietary restrictions. I've got some through to the restaurant, and they're more than happy to accommodate those, but if there are other concerns, just let me know. Also, what's not on here is you all have been sent the expense claim form. Just keep your receipts because we need receipts for your expenses. So anything, taxis, bus fare, whatever, just keep it and submit that with your claim. Okay, so.
Tara,
Uh-huh.
sorry, can I just ask, whereabouts do we get water around here?
There is.
Next to the toilets.
Is there something?
Yeah, so as you exit the lift, on the left is a little recess, there's 3 toilets, and at the end of the little recess, so that's like a...
Okay, I must be blind, I just went out there.
I'm blind too. That's where we'll be having lunch, the breakout room there. So coffee's scheduled at 11, and there will be water coming with the coffee break. Okay. This clicker might work anyway. I should acknowledge our funder, Fisheries Innovation Scotland. So this is an independent nonprofit organization. So you can see here it's really a lot of players contribute money to the pot, and they try and do research that is innovative, but also delivers to the fishing industry broadly in Scotland. So that's why we're here today, and we have to sort of keep that funding source in mind, because that's why the work we're doing is really oriented towards practical implications for Scotland's fisheries. So as much as we tend to think in a global domain, it does have this requirement also to provide information to Scotland. So Scotland is a very proactive industry, and so I think it's to their credit that they're interested in things. We want to get them more interested in things like climate change. Paul here sits on the technical advisory committee that sort of has some degree of oversight of the type of research that's funded by FIS. And we have the executive director of FIS. She's just an incoming executive director. She's coming to public event on Wednesday night. So it's good it'll be a good opportunity for us to make a good impression as well. The live tweeting is via their account. So keeping our presence there just allows people on the FIS board, for example, to see how the money is being used in this activity. Okay, so the aims, you're all pretty familiar with these test weather changes in spatial distribution and individual growth rates of fish show a coherent set of responses on a global scale that are broadly consistent with ecological, physiological, and logical expectations. So I think we all now have a sense of what the possibilities are in our own local waters. How do these compare with the observations in spatial distribution and individual growth that are happening elsewhere? But importantly, this is not meant to be a one-off type of event. This is supposed to be the start of a longer-term research initiative. And really that's why we were interested in combining people who have sort of biological, ecological expertise, as well as government scientists who have not only the data resources, but also the stock assessment expertise. So bringing together those two aspects to work collaboratively on something that is interesting scientifically, but also highly relevant to fisheries management. So that's why we needed to bring the two worlds together, and that sort of was consistent with FIS's basic remit to do industry relevant research. So our deliverables then, let's keep in mind that we've got, this is taken directly from the application. We've set our deliverables in our heads as manuscripts, scientific manuscripts, because scientists generally don't like to show up and have nothing to show for their efforts. So manuscripts are a good incentivization. So we can consider one manuscript, for example, relating to a global synthesis of distributional responses. We can consider another manuscript as looking for commonalities in the response of individual growth rates to climate. On the longer term, we could, and this is not an immediate deliverable, but this is an aspirational deliverable. What can we do if we bring all of these age-length data resources together and combine them into a common analytical framework, looking for what I call the signature of temperature impacts on growth. Fish are ectotherms, temperature impacts their growth. Can we bring a hypothesis-based orientation towards testing a large global data resource? So that's a big ambition. It's not going to happen overnight. But over the long term, when you think of all of the fisheries databases that exist out there, the notable dimension that is missing are age-length data. So that is the long-term goal. But that certainly requires more work, more funding, and we'll talk about that later at some stage in the week. I know that our Australians who patched in, Asta and John, have been very dedicated on this as well. In fact, they had the same idea at about the same time we started thinking down this route. So it was almost like parallel evolution. And so it tells you that if places as different as that are coming up with the same question in their minds, then it's very much a question that's worth addressing. So we're just trying to bring together the people with interests in doing this. Okay, as well, we've got the public dissemination on Wednesday. And this will take public dissemination of results. This is two forms. The final project report. These reports appear on the FIS website, so they're a long-term legacy of the work that goes into this week. And then we've got the public outreach event on Wednesday. Greta?
Tara, have you thought about us maybe writing a collaborative article for the conversation or something like that?
That's a good idea. Yeah. Yeah, we can discuss. We're not locked into, aside from these two, we're really not locked into anything. So we can include or exclude everything. But I think that the idea is that from this final project report, these manuscripts get created so that they fall out. In fact, there's a draft of the final report already on Google Docs. You might have noticed that it's sort of the place where, when we have some free time for writing, you can, write your contribution about what you presented, put it into the report, and then with a little sort of collaborative thinking, we can figure out whether this is a packageable unit for publication. Also, we've got a short presentation that will stimulate this discussion discussion. We've got a few presentations set aside should we have some slack time in the meeting. So one of them is on publication, what should be our publication strategy. And that might become clearer through the week as we figure out, okay, yeah, there really is stuff here. We also have to think about how other important publications, for example, the FAO report, Myron, you were just part of that, right?
Yeah.
So that hit like a thud in the summer, that 600-page report. And
You called it a doorstop, yeah.
Yeah, it's
Yeah.
massive.
The climate change one?
Yeah, it was,
Regions?
yeah, it was an update to an FAO volume, and the FAO volume was number 627, I think it was 628 pages. And John Pinnerger and I did the Atlantic and Northern Atlantic region, and then folks from our Pisces collaborators did the Pacific. And we went through and the evidence base for shifts, both historical and then looked at projections. And then we spent quite a considerable amount of text on vulnerability of communities. So I can put that up on the, I'll put our chapter on our SharePoint.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we did the Australia chapter for
Yeah.
that, but ours, I'm sure, won't be anywhere near as good as yours because Manuel asked us for it within a week, and
Oh.
Alistair Hobday went, "Yeah, all right, we can do that." And I went, "Are you kidding?"
It's a really good product, but the one thing I will say is that we were rushed, not as rushed as you were, but when you have that many chapters, if you read through carefully some of the more general synthetic chapters, and then you look for evidence within the regions, it doesn't necessarily always match up. So I think that, it was a good effort, but we could have used a couple more months to basically look across all the chapters and find common messages. We didn't do that. So that would be a good place for this group to start when looking at those chapters.
Yeah. Okay, so that perspective and experience here will be very useful in trying to guide us as to what we should be doing with the collective knowledge that we synthesize. Okay, so this is meant to be a sort of conceptual starting point, this presentation. So trying to get, hi Bjarte Bogstad has just joined us from Bergen.
Yeah.
Welcome.
Thanks.
We're streaming live, Bjarte. Is there anything you want to say to the world?
Okay.
Well, actually, it's only two people in Australia,
Yeah.
John and Asta.
Yeah.
Okay, so anyway, the conceptual starting point, I think it's important to have a common sort of understanding just as we get started off. And so these are some of the thoughts that Paul and I put together to try where we're coming from and where our starting point is. And it's always nice to go back to the roots in ecology and biology, because then that sort of places you firmly in the academic sphere of knowledge, what we can contribute to in that sphere generally, rather than just thinking fisheries. And I really was late to come across the Moran effect, but the more I read about it, the more I realized this is exactly what we're going after, is the Moran effect. It's looking, it refers to the synchronizing effect of environmental forcing, and it's one of the most likely explanations of inter- and intraspecific temporal synchrony over spatial scales. It's been investigated widely. For example, spatial synchrony in coral reef populations, things like that. So this is one, I think, as much as we haven't couched it in those terms, I think this is really what we're getting. The key words, temporal synchrony being the sort of signature of environmental forcing that is operating over very broad spatial scales. And certainly climate change falls into that type of thing. So what ecological or physiological responses would we expect to show temporal synchrony across warming ecosystems, or the reverse in cooling ecosystems? And this is a classic work again by Dauphren, published in 2009. It is not marine related, but it's a very widely cited paper, and they highlight 3 responses that he classifies as universal. First one being spatial distribution, second one being phenology, and the third one being body size. Now, this is generally what people fall back on. For example, Manuel, I just saw a presentation he gave on climate change in Bergen last week, and he said exactly these 3 responses. So our workshop is dealing with 2 of these responses, spatial distribution and body size. We're leaving phenology out, but I do have a short presentation on phenology that we can look at if there's some slack time, because we are doing some research here. And the 3 of them as a package, I think, fall very nicely together, and they all have big consequences for the fishing industry. Body size, it's got some classic ecological foundations, Bergman's rule, James' rule. These are 2 rules that really describe biogeographic distribution of species. The one that we like to look at is the temperature size rule. This suggests that the individual body size decreases within an increasing temperature, and this can really work for a single stock. You know, this is describing the distribution, you know, from one place to another, but this can really, temperature size rule is more getting at something that operates over time, and therein lies its link to temporal synchrony. So haddock may in the North Sea will stay in the North Sea a certain portion. They're still there, but they're just experiencing warming. And that's where the temperature size rule becomes relevant. So the universality of the response, this is what I call the sort of logic underpinning it. If climate change impacts are universal, then you really should exhibit a degree of cross-species synchrony and common temporal trends. This is the Moran effect, right? You should be able to detect the Moran effect somehow. But the problem is that temporal trends in things like growth are also impacted by a wide variety of other factors such as food availability and competition and disease, whatever. So these are really non-universal, species-specific, and in our consideration, they're asynchronous noise, right? We're less interested in these non-universal factors than we are teasing out the potential universal factor. So that's the sort of logical distinction that you have to make. We're not trying to explain all variation. We're trying to tease out one component part of the variation. So really, a temporal response has a certain, characteristic. If you do your time series analysis, you can decompose it. What we're looking for is directional signals. In the case of an ecosystem that would be showing a directional signal towards warming or cooling. And then everything else falls into the bucket of noise that we're less interested in. At least this is how, other people might approach this, but this sort of synchronous signal is what I call the signature, and it should be operating reasonably coherently across broad spatial scales, as well as within an ecosystem across all the different species that are impacted by temperature in that ecosystem. If you can detect a signature that seems to meet these ecological, biological, logical, then you can bed it into the projection models that you use to project the impacts of climate change, whether they be related to distribution or related to body size. You can't really get at projections unless you've used observations to inform the model. So that's the longer term, broader objective of all of this. And this figure from a paper by Alistair Hopday and Greta really encouraged us to treat the global warming situation as almost an experiment. And that's trying to make lemonades out of lemons, but as scientists, it does present this opportunity. On the doorstep, we have the North Sea, which is considered a hot spot of warming, and that's why scientists such as Brian and John have been so active looking at climate change impacts on the North Sea, because there are a lot that have been detected, and so we're starting to understand they are important, and we're figuring out what it is they're saying for future fish. So starting off with distribution then, Bergman's rule, I've already mentioned, it has to do with biogeography. It predicts expansion of smaller bodied fish into warming waters because we associate small body sizes with those warmer. So this is what I call thing one with respect to distribution. And certainly some of the classic papers, some of the first papers about this type of redistribution were done in the North Sea. I remember Alison Perry, I was at a conference, I don't know if Myron was at this conference in Bergen, maybe Berta was, where she's doing her master's, and she presented, it was a meeting on climate change in Bergen before 2005, and she presented this work, and the whole place lit up on fire, and the next thing you knew, it was published in Science, and that was her master's thesis, you know. So it's really, it's one of the sort of foundational papers that suggests that there is redistribution going on, followed up by Nick Dulvey, who used, again, the DATRAS data, did more, I think, detailed and nuanced understanding. And so this was starting to use the power of fisheries data to unlock changes in distribution. I think he came to a more nuanced understanding of spatial distribution. It mightn't have been as simple as the original Perry et al. And then recently we've got Alan, and you can speak to Fish Dish. I'll turn the mic over to you because
well, it wasn't only me. It was a group of us taking part in a workshop, or an ICES workshop. This workshop took part as a result of a request from the EU Commission, who wanted to know what was the status for the European fish stocks in terms of movement, if they've moved a lot or not, and to assess what could be the possible consequences. So what we did in the workshop, we used trawl survey data for all the stocks that we've got in northern waters, so from Portugal all the way to Norway. So all data we could get, and we used 3 different statistical methods to assess changes in distribution. And we also performed a literature review to try and see, investigate what could be the drivers of those changes. The literature review was because we didn't have physically the time to do a statistical analysis for each one of these species. And we found that most species have moved, and we identified a list of possible drivers, biogeography and weather condition, mainly temperature, density habitat, density-dependent habitat selection, and a few other drivers. But environmental condition, mainly temperature, and density-dependent habitat selection were the two standards across all these drivers. You can maybe.
yeah.
And so we identified as a list what we call the big movers, those are the ones that shifted across ICES areas. So anchovy, anglerfish, blue whiting, cod, hake, mackerel and megrim, and plaice. And among those stocks, we also identified a few that, I don't have the list with me just now, but we identified a few that shifted across management areas which are used to set the TLC, which could potentially be a management implication when setting quotas. And so one key result of the workshop was that because we identified so many drivers and because we had so many discrepancies among the movement of each species, it showed that it's to predict accurately changes in distribution is really hard because there's so many factors that can play a role, and also each species is different, so we'll act differently to those drivers. And so, following that workshop, we are writing up a paper to sum up those results a bit more efficiently. one of the statistical methods that we use in this workshop was the changes in spatial occurrence. So basically a presence absence in each axis rectangle. And we summed up those results in two ways. So the first at the top. So on this axis here, for each species in each axis area, we got the position of the species in the latitude, in the position of the population within the species range, from a species located in the southern part of its range and in the northern part of this range. And we saw that species that are located towards the northern part of the range, they tend to show more increase in spatial occurrence compared to species in the southern part of its range, which tend to show more decrease in spatial occurrence compared to a decrease. And that black line here is the number of observation. And we did the same with abundance. So here we use stock size. So we've got less bins because we only have decreasing trend in stock size, no change on an increasing trend. And we can also see there, although not as clearly, that species would have overall increasing abundance tend to show more of an increase in spatial occurrence compared to species with a decreasing trend, which show more decrease in spatial occurrence. So through this, yeah, okay, so last slide for that. So this meta-analysis kind of showed that those two main drivers impacting distribution. So that's something we can see across species. Even though, like regionally, latitude is not necessarily a good proxy for distribution, but on the overall, at the European scale, we see that signal across species.
Okay. Okay, so we've got the situation where fish may move to maintain some type of thermal preference, but they may just stay put and experience the warming. In the North Sea, the warming is on, sort of over the past 30, 40 years is briny. I think of it as between 1 and 2 degrees. Doesn't sound like a lot, but it is if you're an ectotherm. And so then there's the potential for physiological impacts on phenology and individual growth as postulated in the original Dufresne paper. So what can we see there? And again, we're going back to the starting point of really the root of so much in understanding the fisheries, the von Berlanti growth function. You could spend your life, as people like Anna Pauli has, understanding the meaning that's captured in the von Berlanti, but it's the more you study it, the more fascinating it becomes. But according to the temperature size rule, it should predict that adult body sizes will be smaller relative to the sizes that were achieved in colder waters. So that is the prediction. That's what I call thing 2, right? There's thing 2. So the physiological basis of temperature size rule is being actively studied and debated, and ASCA, who's patched in from Tasmania, has taken the lead in combining, entering the literature, recent publication in global ecology and biogeography. So the particular nature of the debate has to do with the degree of oxygen limitation that is the physiological basis of the response. So there's certainly an active debate going on about that. And this falls into the realm of conservation physiology. We're not going to disappear, at least at this meeting, down this particular rabbit hole, other than to acknowledge that it exists and is being worked on by physiologists and ecologists. But the thing that can be done, and really the reason that we're interested in bringing together so many of the age-length key databases is that Alan, as part of his PhD thesis, used the DATRAS database and was able to fit the von Berlanti growth curves to a total of 8 different species in the North Sea, for which long time series of age and length were available. So he did on cohort by cohort basis for the cohorts 1970 to 2006. So it's his statistical code that did this that will be included in one of our modeling approaches that he'll talk about subsequently. So he found that they were shrinking, their L infinities over the time period had decreased. The variability, the magnitude of variability was different. But you can see that for some stocks, they were quite large. For example, haddock, which is an important commercial fishery for Scotland, 30% decrease in L infinity. Keep in mind that this is a subtle impact because the people catching the fish don't appreciate their age structure, so that a smaller fish is not is a small fish, but you can't appreciate whether it's a young fish or an old fish. So this is a subtle response, and I think the headlines at the time the publication came out, the industry wasn't going to accept this message of shrinking fish lying down. So a few interesting headlines hit the press. Okay, so that is the background on combining, sort of distribution and growth. Now we then had a portion of the presentation called combining the two of them, but in the interest of time, Paul, do you think we should do this or the management implications at this point?
Maybe the management stuff.
The management, okay, why don't you come up here and review the management stuff?
Okay.
So this is really a tag team effort here. And so what we'll do with this bit, where you can very easily unify distribution and growth, and Paul's had some thinking on that topic, but we'll save that for another slap time, just in the interest of reasonably trying to stay on schedule.
Okay. Well, I definitely have less slides on the management stuff. But as Tara said, we're here because FIS has funded us to be here. They're very interested in Scottish fisheries and especially the aspect of distribution. In kind of thinking about it, I came across some, kind of common examples, some really well-said examples of how changes in distribution, can affect fishery management. So maybe next slide. So this is a paper by Malin Finsky, who I think will be joining us in about an hour and a half. This actually came out in 2012, so a while back, but he's done a lot of work showing that fish distributions, especially in the northeast U.S., have moved north, and that's shown in the black line here. So this is the mean latitude of these different fish species, kind of moving up the coast. And as you might know, in the northeast U.S., we have a lot of states that have kind of relatively small areas, so they're moving from kind of state to state up the Atlantic seaboard. And what's interesting is that the fisheries have not moved as fast as the fish. So that's shown in the two gray lines here. One is the mean latitude of the catch in terms of weight, and then I think one of the other lines is the mean latitude of the value of the catch. And in most cases they're pretty similar. But so we see for like American lobster, they were catching these things up in Maine, as you might know. So the stock is kind of moving closer to where they're being caught in the first place. Same with the yellowtail flounders, so maybe that's not so much an issue. Although with the redhead, you see something that's the opposite. In here, the stock has moved quite a bit far north, but the fishery has not moved north to keep up with it. So what we see is that the proportion of effort is kind of highest now in the southern part of the stock because they haven't really shifted, and it could lead to localized depletion in these areas. We're kind of fishing the trailing edge of the population harder than we're fishing the rest of the whole stock. And of course, it's, they talk a little bit about all the factors that delay fishermen from moving north, especially when you're talking about moving across state lines. It's not so easy for a fisherman to kind of land fishing in ports that they're not accustomed to. There might be impediments to doing that. So that's one example. If you look at this internationally, these kind of shifting stocks, they're really, if you think it complicates governance, between states within a country, it more so complicates governance between countries themselves. So this is a more recent paper by Malin, came out just a few months ago. This map here is EEZs all over the world, and wherever you see a non-white color, there's at least one transboundary stock that's expected to occur, one more, by the year 2100. So some areas are, pretty red, like especially in the northern parts where I'm from, northern, the Arctic up in Alaska and, Arctic up here as well. But, they also did some projections looking at the number of stocks that would kind of cross between boundaries based on some climate scenarios. And we see that under kind of RCP 8.5, which is kind of business as usual. It's about 60 stocks or so, that would kind of cross boundaries. Even under a more, kind of a more aggressive emission scenario, more aggressive controlled emissions, RCP 2.6, kind of cut down on emissions. We still see about 46 stocks that we expect to move by the year 2060. So they make the point in the paper that sometimes we have the biggest conflicts, or very large conflicts, in cases where you might have one stock that's not even that critical, in terms of economic importance. So you can imagine what happens when you have all these stocks and moving, and some are quite valuable. And, it's just a rather kind of cogent term in their paper. Essentially what they're saying is that our management system is kind of designed, with boundaries that are set in place, and the associated that stocks don't move. So when you have stocks that do move, it really kind of complicates things. I mentioned kind of fishing at your edge of the population. That can occur too. If you think your stock is going to be leaving your area, there's less incentive to conserve it because it's not going to be there anyway. Or on the other hand, if you're receiving a stock, you might not have, if there's a kind of a lag time, in sort of recognizing that this is a stock that you should manage in the future. So kind of complicates things on both ends. And finally, think about fish size. Different sizes of fish have different economic value. And this is some work that Alan Haney has done, looking at this with the walleye pollock fishery. They're made into different products. For example, larger pollock are made into fillets. A smaller product, is less valuable, goes in fish meal. And he's done a lot of, Alan will be here later this week too, but Alan's done a lot of really detailed work looking at how climate change affects the fishing industry and the choices they make on where we're going to fish. And he talks about a fishery landscape, which is determined by things like mandated delivery times. These are mandated because the fish processors want the product to be fresh. They want the fillets to be fresh fish, whereas fish meal is not so important. So if a processor is making fillets, it wants its fish to be no more than a certain amount of time since they caught it. So they have mandated delivery times. Fish size is a big part of what the product is and how fishermen make their choices. Of course, the fishermen want to choose where to catch the fish. They want to choose the places with high catch rates, but they also want to avoid bycatch, and bycatch management is a big part of our system. That's as much as the drivers of fisher locations as their target species. And of course, pollock, the adults are pretty sensitive to temperatures. They move around in time and in space, and the fishermen have to know this, and that affects their choices in where to fish as well. So it's a pretty complicated story, but one of the messages is that the fishery is kind of segregated into two groups. At least the near shore, these are catcher boats, not catch processors, but the shorter fish, shorter trip vessels make obviously shorter trips, but they kind of target the larger fish that live closer to shore, whereas the larger vessels are able to move farther offshore and they catch more variability in sizes. So this graph kind of just shows some patterns over time. The triangles here are shorter trip groups, and they're getting kind of bigger fish closer to shore. But this kind of paper shows the complexity of how fish size can really affect economic value and fisher choice. And you can imagine a situation where if here the changes in size are kind of more isogenic, but if size at age changes because of the temperature size will, because of climate change, you can imagine that it could also have some effects on economic value too. So that's what I had for the imagine piece. I tried to highlight stuff that like Malin and Alan works in that we have later in the week to talk about too.
So that's it. That was our attempt to, I don't know, kickstart the discussion. Just, John, are you still there? Can you still hear us? You're muted right now.
Yes.
Okay. We're not hearing you, but are you hearing us okay?
Can you hear me now?
I heard very well.
Okay, great.
A nice presentation.
Good, good. We'll, how is our timetable so far?
We've got 15 minutes.
We've got how many
10,
minutes?
15 minutes.
Okay, so we've got some time for discussion, and like that was our conceptualization. Any comments on that, or things we left out, or,
How's that question?
okay?
Yeah, I think that the distribution paradigm is quite interesting, and yet it can be really quite confounding. And the reason I say that is because in a lot of areas, our survey ability is affected by areas we haven't surveyed. So like catchability may change. And one of the concerns I have is what we perceive as distribution changes and also changes in the stock dynamics may be obfuscated by our inability to monitor the population well. And so I think when we start talking about the empirical data and what we're seeing, I think we need to be concerned about how the data that we rely on may have changed. And so I think it would be worth, a discussion about, how many areas have actually tried to analyze in the face of the changing distributions whether the catchability has fundamentally changed in their monitoring capabilities.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other thing is I could say that what we have found in the Pacific Northwest, in the Alaska region, is a number of species actually have moved quite a bit north. And it may be an aperiodic event, but due to the some warming climate events, like what we call the worm blob, we have found several gadded species to be considerably farther north than our typical survey areas. And so what we understand to be a stationary event historically may no longer be a stationary event in the future.
Okay. And that would have direct
Yeah,
stock assessment.
Well, it may completely, again, it might alter the way we perceive these processes that we're looking at.
Yeah.
I mean, effectively what you're saying is you're no longer surveying the full stock, you're only surveying a portion of the stock.
Yeah, and
right?
it may
Your
be
survey-
a group of age classes that are specific to that specific movement.
Right, which for some of these ecosystems means that we'll have to be kind of careful about potentially linking data sets. For example, the thing called California current in Gulf of Alaska,
Yeah.
right? Because the peacock and the California current are probably going to go away, right?
Right.
And they're going to be shifting more, for example.
I get there's a lot. I guess there's more. That's probably the tip of the iceberg in terms of examples. I mean, the mackerel surveys in Europe, I know, for the spawning stock are conducted every 3 years, and they're in the wrong place, now essentially because of the shift. And they were well planned. They're conducted every 3 years, and now they're not really hitting mackerel as well as they would like to. And I mean, the other thing that you probably were going to talk about in the part on growth and distribution was we were involved in some work on anchovy in the North Sea, and that was a lot of fun because we realized those anchovies were genetically distinct from the Bay of Biscay. So what you would think would just be a northern migration of fish swimming into the North Sea was actually a relict population that became much more productive. So distinguishing changes in productivity of a species like cod, which is doing great in some areas where the art is eating it, versus where there's no one from Ireland here. So I think distinguishing changes in distribution from productivity is sometimes difficult and important, and our monitoring needs to adapt. And I don't know what our message is in terms of monitoring the data sets. Do we have them? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I would just follow up on that. I mean, it seems to be in the example of the macro and others, huge emphasis on precision at the expense of potential huge bias. And you have the arguments with the egg survey people, for example. Do half as many transects in your core area and just move north, for example. They don't want to do that because they have this fixation that the precision will be affected. And so you go from a CV, I don't know, of maybe 20% up to 25 potentially, if you did that. And they don't see that the bias is causing them huge problems. And we have that being at the benchmark, right, where they just have their hands in their head saying, no, we don't see it, we don't see the problem. And you're right, I don't think it's a catchability issue necessarily. I'm not sure that the gear changes or the vertical distribution may have changed, that might be one thing, but availability and coverage is massive. And if you look historically, for example, at the Hake situation, we've been trying to do that to see, what was the relative stability period for Hake in 73 to 78. The data's not there, because you've only got North Sea going that far. So, yeah, I mean, when we do our surveys and where we do our surveys is a big thing.
Yeah, I would just follow up that I think availability is probably the bigger issue, but catchability can also be a sort of a nominal issue if you have distributional shifts that are age specific, which we have seen actually.
Oh yes, very, very much so. In bands in Norwegian Sea, we have also been lagging. Expansion of survey area has been lagging behind expansion of the stock. But what I like to point out that we've also seen much bigger changes in feeding areas than in spawning areas. The changes in spawning areas has been relatively minor, and I mean this has to do with both that spawning areas will be kind of disjunct over, and also this with closing the life cycle and migrating, spawning migration against the current. But sorting out this, the survey time series when you have been continuously, when you have been, well, let's see, for Balsey Cod, we made the survey area in 1981, we expanded it in 93, 94, and then again in 2014. But now, don't think the cod can go that much farther north, so, because then it will end up in the Arctic Ocean. So, well, there's a lot of this with the, I guess we're getting to this, but also there are quite a bit of depth constraints on some stocks. And also, one thing is preferred temperature, another thing is what temperature you can have the temperature limits. That's, I think for something like cod, the preferred temperature, the possible temperature range is quite wide. Thanks.
Okay, so a lot of our discussion is focusing around the distribution aspect now. Just to throw something controversial out there, just to sort of try and close this off. Distribution is inherently complex. It's a moving target, right? So is there anybody who would like to argue that we could at some point have a coherent enough understanding of drivers of distribution to project it forward, or is it simply something that we have to accept as being inherently unpredictable?
The comment I have is the distribution is definitely, innately a real problem to deal with. And from an assessment modeling perspective, it will be. But my bigger concern is that, if we start seeing some functional relationships between, say, however you want to characterize distribution, that the most recent years will be driving the relationship. So you could have a cluster of data in a response, say, your domain in the X is, say, temperature, and your domain in the Y is the centroid of the distribution. And so you could have these points out on the upper right end of the graph that are producing a significant functional response. But if for the most recent data points, And they probably will be. I think the question we have to ask is how robust is that data relative to what we're trying to understand? So it comes down to understanding the impact that, you know, some of these changes have had temporally with regard to, you know, the centroid of the distribution or the response in some type of growth, somatic growth or whatever. You kind of follow what I'm saying?
Yeah, so you're like.
When we start seeing stuff, and
Yeah.
this is just, because we've already have seen quite a few functional responses between body size and temperature, and a lot of that is largely driven by some most recent effects that probably encompass not only a true temperature response, but also something having to do with the fundamental data that we collect in the survey. So there's, you know, all I'm saying is, you know, there's some cautionary notes I think that we have to be cognizant of. And from our experience, you know, we're still trying to make some sense of that. Whether it's, you know, real response or whether it's just, you know, spurious.
Okay, so you seem to be saying that, you know, the functional responses like growth
Yeah.
or phenology might be more tractable than the distribution side.
I didn't hear that.
Oh, okay.
But-
Like that there's
but I
sources of
think that-
noise in our data,
I think that
trying to get at the distributional response.
the body size temperature response is going to be not independent from the distribution response.
Oh, okay, yeah.
And so when we see distributions that are changing, and then our survey ability to monitor that response can be compromised.
Well, especially, like you said earlier, I mean, if some age groups moved faster than others, you know, the age groups that you can survey that are left, you might show a change in response, maybe one way.
That's right. And so I would just say it's a cautionary note that when we get to that stage, that we have to consider.
And it seems like, I mean, you asked, you know, whether we know enough to project what distributions to do in the future, but I think people are doing it now. I mean,
Anyway.
I mean, there's just distribution models that are getting
Right.
better, you know, but the stuff I've read, you know, people are kind of recognizing the limitations of those. Like they don't, you know, it may tell you if a stock has a certain association with temperature, even from very sound laboratory experiments, you know, mapping out the biogenics, you know, they'll tell you that, you know, this is the habitat for the stock, you know, now this will be habitat for the stock in the future, but they don't quite make the link of how it gets from here to there and all things that can happen along the way. You know, all these interactions, you know, all the, like you mentioned